Thanks for clicking on Wayne.com for this week's edition of Inside the Zone with Justin Kinney of Optimum Performance Sports. Joining us, and Justin, let's get right to it.
Okay.
How did you feel after week one in terms of what you thought was going to happen and what actually happened? Because I got to be honest, this was probably, and I guess you could see it coming based on the pandemic and just everything surrounding uncertainty and no fans and all the policies out there. This was like one of the wildest week ones that we've seen in a long time. But it was fun to cover and amazing to see what was going to happen out there.
It's 2020, right? There's just chaos everywhere. Why not on Friday nights in high school football? So you have Northside come out and they just lay the wood on Snyder. Their most lopsided win against the Panthers since 1988. Most points they've ever scored in a single game against Snyder. So they come out emphatically, the Legends, and make a statement. And then you have Northrop, while Homestead playing shorthanded on defense, but still, what Demarius Cohen was able to do and the rest of that team to get a win, first ever win against the Spartans. A lot of fun last week in the SAC.
I want to start there when you mentioned Northside. Was this a case of we underrated Northside? Did we overrate Snyder? What was the situation? Because a lot of people don't realize how many seniors Snyder lost off last year's team. But as I was talking with your buddy Dan Vance out there, you don't expect Snyder to ever rebuild. You expect them to reload. And it's been a long time since Snyder has had to rebuild a bit. So where are they? Where is Northside? What do we know about these two teams based off that game?
I think it's tough to, after 1 week, make an assertion on what we can take from that game. Is Snyder worse than we thought? I think you can say that for the first week. I mean, they had trouble lining up in simple defensive alignments for Snyder. There was a lot of confusion on both sides of the football. When they put Luke Hoppert in at quarterback, I think you saw them settle down a little bit, and I think that's the long-term answer for Snyder. Northside, you feel a little bit better, I think, than what you started at the beginning of the year, because you were like, people are talking Northside, but until they go out and beat somebody, we're not sure. I mean, to beat Snyder by 30 is incredibly impressive. What Deuce Taylor was able to do, impressive. And now I think the bar has been raised significantly enough to say, okay, now we need to see you against Bishop Dwenger this week.
Here's the question for me in Northside. At the beginning, we were talking about, you talk about the Big Four, and Mike Brevard mentioned this after the game. They hadn't really beaten a Big Four team during his tenure there. Now do you have to view them as a legit SAC contender? I know it's 1 week, but you get a win over Snyder under your belt. That's a pretty good way to start off a season.
Yeah. It's incredibly good, but I can guarantee you that Mike Brevard is making sure those guys today are turning that page because they have to face Dwenger on Friday. So they can bask over the weekend winning over Snyder. I think you put them in the SAC championship hunt conversation right now after 1 week. But we'll know a lot more where teams are, I think, after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks. Because remember, Northside, win or lose against Bishop Dwenger, they still have Carroll sitting there, which, after 1 week, you think they're at least in the top three in the SAC. So it's that gauntlet that Northside runs the first 3 weeks. They've passed the first test. Now they have test number 2 coming up.
When you take a look at Northrop's win before we move on to next week, obviously they ran the football extremely well.
Yeah.
But is this an indication of what we're going to see from Northrop throughout the season? Because we've talked about last year was a step up. It was their best year in 13 years, and they thought they could make another step this year. Is this just a manifestation of that, or was it partly because Homestead wasn't fully manned, if you will? And I don't want to lay it on that because Northrop played a great football game.
Yeah.
But there are going to be weeks where teams are going to be without players, whether they have tested positive or whether they're just being quarantined. Like there are going to be weeks where not everybody has everybody to play.
Yeah, and I think you need to take advantage of those moments, and Northrop took advantage of the opportunity. Homestead was not 100%, not even close on defense, and Northrop took advantage of that opportunity. So it's not an excuse to why Homestead lost. It's more of Northrop came in, they recognized they had a chance there to make a point, and they did. I think it's an encouraging thing for Northrop because we saw them win 5 games last year, and you say, okay, now, does Northrop continue to go upward or do they regress? And to come out week 1 and beat Homestead, whether they were shorthanded or not, is a great first step.
Before we move on to next week, what are some of the week 1 performances that either surprised you, impressed you? What are your biggest takeaways from week 1? Because it was an unpredictable week.
It was, absolutely. And I look at, across the board, we mentioned Deuce Taylor and how phenomenal he was. I think Jeff Becker just, picked up where he left off at Bishop Luers. I felt like we talked last week, okay, Bishop Luers should be better, but they really got run off their own field last Friday against Carroll. And elsewhere, I think Columbia City was impressive, but that's a very young, inexperienced Cherubusco team that they took on. Leo was impressive, but we know that Woodland's rebuilding. So we have some interesting games on the schedule here in week 2 that, okay, that team looked good week 1, but now we can really go forward and see and get a greater sample size as opposed to just 4 quarters of football.
I'm going